Please be comfortable in the best way you can. If anyone's hot, remove jackets and so on. I'm going to remove mine in a moment. And sort of get comfortable so that we can take in all that Nikko Shonin, the second high priest, successor to Nichiren Daishonin, asked that we should, basically, by his deciding just 3 weeks before he died, at a fine age of 88 years old. And at that time, 3 weeks before he died, he decided he must write what are now known as the 26 Admonitions, or warnings, of Nikko Shonin. So, of course, you can tell that since he chose such a time to exert himself to write these admonitions, they must be incredibly important. Because it's very obvious, isn't it, that he was quite determined that he couldn't possibly die without writing them for posterity, for the future. So this all happened in the year 1333. Easy year to remember, 1333. And what is more, he chose to write these 26 warnings on the 13th of the year 1333. And then 20 days later, he passed away on the 7th of February. So he was a grand old age, and as you may know, he started to practice as a very young priest with Nichiren Daishonin himself, just for a year or two before Nichiren Daishonin died. And the time Nikko Shonin chose to pass away was just 51 years after Nichiren Daishonin's death, so he'd had a long and great life. So in fact, this year then, 1993, is the 660th anniversary, isn't it, of the death of Nikko Shonin, that we're choosing here in the UK and elsewhere in the world to study the 26 warnings. So they have proved to be of extraordinary importance, though one hasn't seen so much mention of them. Nevertheless, at the foundation of the whole problem with the priesthood can be laid the 26 warnings of Nikko, because Nikken and those who follow him have broken all those admonitions, have not followed them in any sense at all, and this will become apparent to you as we go on with this talk this afternoon. Not a single one of these warnings has been heeded by this regime who caused us all a lot of problems, to say the least. So Nikko Shonin's action in writing these admonitions just a few days before he died, of course, was given great impetus because he himself had had enormous trouble with difficult and traitorous priests, his fellow priests. This was just after Nichiren Daishonin died, when Nikko was still a young man, but nevertheless, very clearly, Nichiren Daishonin had stated in 2 different documents that when he died, Nikko Shonin should succeed him as high priest of his Buddhism. And he walked into trouble straight away, because these 5 elder priests, as they're known, they were all not young priests, but well-established priests, a number of years each, turned totally against Nikko. But they didn't only turn against Nikko, they turned against their master. They turned against Nichiren Daishonin in the sense that they refused even to come and pray beside the body of Nichiren Daishonin after he died. This was terrible distress for Nikko to find that he was faced with this problem of these priests who, for one reason or another, refused to pay their homage to Nichiren Daishonin. The reasons for this were, I suppose, numerous. One was certainly that they had never understood really what Nichiren Daishonin was teaching. That was perhaps the main reason of all. They'd no doubt nodded their heads and said yes, but in fact they didn't understand, really. This was evident later because they all, in one way or another, either joined existing sects or other sects of Buddhism, that is, or even in one or two cases founded their own sects. And in the way in which they taught what Nichiren Daishonin had taught, one can quickly discover their lack of understanding, or shallow understanding. That is to say, they failed to understand that Buddhahood existed in everybody, and that Nichiren Daishonin himself was a Buddha, and therefore they viewed him really as a bodhisattva, and certainly their fellow priests and lay people as something much below what Nichiren Daishonin intended, and what indeed his writings all said. But no doubt in those days study was probably lacking. Even astonishing as it may seem, it was discovered that in the head temple Taisekaji, in modern times, the young priests were only given, these are ordained priests, only given 8 hours Gosho study in one whole year in their program of work. Incredible it is. All the rest of the time they were having to serve their senior priests. Yet, as you will come to it, in the 26 admonitions, there is an admonition specifically saying that priests would be taught Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin, and would not spend undue time looking after their senior priests. Yet, that is what they've had to do. And the very young priests virtually had no Gosho instruction whatsoever until they reached the age of about 22 or 23, when they began. So this is extraordinary, but is a fact. So one can tell from this how rare, in a way, it was to find a really well-founded priest of great faith. So anyway, the 5 priests turned out to be the worms in the bowels of the lion, and they turned on Nikko, as I was saying, and left the head temple, refusing even to come back to do their stint beside the body of Nichiren Daishonin. So altogether, this must have been a terrific shock to Nikko, and would certainly have been an important reason for him to have written these 26 warnings before he died. So, although Gosho lectures are in a way much more digestible, and a good deal in a way more easy, I think, to talk about, because there is an argument, a theme that follows through every Gosho, and makes it very beautiful and easy to follow. But nevertheless, though it would be nice to talk about the Gosho this afternoon, I feel it's of immense importance that we should all understand these 26 warnings. And this is why I've done so many lectures on the subject, so that as many people as possible in the UK should actually have the chance of studying these warnings, so that we don't allow any mistakes to occur in the future, and so that we really understand the foundations on which Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism is really based. So after this lecture, which is the last, I think, of the 26 Admonitions lectures, then I'll work on a version in a manuscript for the UK Express, so it's there for everyone to turn up whenever they want to. So for all these reasons, I feel it's incredibly important to understand these thoroughly. So to elaborate a bit on why these admonitions are so important, I'd like to mention a few other things as well. So one is that through the whole matter of the blow-up with the priesthood, I think everyone, all of us, have had to really take a long, hard look at our faith. In some people it stirred up old doubts that had been tucked away somewhere under the carpet for a long time. In other people it stirred up doubts which they'd probably never dreamt about before. Whatever happened, it made us all look at ourselves very strongly, I think you'll agree, from the point of view of faith, what it means to have faith in Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, and what is the faith that is my faith? Is it Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, or is it some other form of faith? Is it Dick Corsten's faith, or Bill Jarvis's faith? Is it his Buddhism or my Buddhism, rather than Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism that we're practicing? Is it President Ikeda's Buddhism? Or is it truly Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism? This is really, in one way or another, what we've all had to fight within ourselves about over these last couple of years. And that can't be anything else but very good for us all. We've all had to challenge these things. So, at the same time, I hope and believe that what we've discovered through these challenges is that our faith is, though of course could be much better, but nevertheless it is strong and based on correct lines. And when you study these warnings, one, or you and I, don't need to have any fear that we're going to discover we've been doing everything wrong, and that we'll earn, the wrath of the heavens upon us or anything like that. Actually, what they confirm is the strict and correct way we have been brought up in faith, in fact. Because Mr. Makiguchi, who founded the Soka Gakkai, then Mr. Todo, and then Sensei, who followed him, were in themselves strict. And fortunately, as you'll hear, there was a period when the Gakkai was reformed after World War II, when fortunately there were 2 or 3 great high priests in succession who gave enormous help and understanding to Mr. Todo in his great efforts to build something that could never, ever be destroyed. So the 26 warnings, in that sense, are a great comfort to us, that we have, in fact, been doing things right. So the second point I wanted to make is that the priests who have failed to abide by these 26 warnings, of course, have mirrored, in that sense, what this problem of what should a priest be in terms of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism. What is the function of a priest as opposed to the function of the lay person? What sort of priests did Nichiren Daishonin wish to have? And, where are the priests going to be found for the future? Are they, in that sense, from amongst the priests that we know now? Or have they gone too far? Where does it begin and where does it end, this whole matter of the priesthood? So as you know, there are just 50 or so priests who have now severed their links with the high priest and the head temple. This is quite a small body. One would have liked to have seen more, but we know now that the remainder of the priesthood, which would be in the region of, say, 1,200, not a very large number, but nevertheless, they're chained, it seems, through fear. This has become apparent because the 50 priests who have seceded have made a point of going and visiting and talking with their ex-colleagues who are still in the head temple or still priests of Nichiren Shoshu. And this is what they've discovered. Fear for two reasons. Firstly, that Nikken has used absolutely merciless spiritual blackmail, I think one might call it, on the priesthood, with threats, of the hell of the incessant suffering and so on. Well, one may think, why should that have such an effect? But if you've been a priest, or rather, if you've lived in the precincts of the head temple since you were 7 years old, and if you've been brainwashed in a way over all those years, if you spent the first 10 years of your life there cleaning the loos for the priests, your elder priests, and ironing their clothes and polishing their boots and doing their laundry, making their bed and all the rest of it, one has to sort of imagine the effect of that on the mind of any person. And then, of course, entering, as they grew up, into what was an incredibly authoritarian regime, where instant and absolute obedience was required in every respect, and such matters as discussions on the Gosho virtually never took place. So this was a very narrow environment for these wretched people, I think. Then, of course, added to that, suddenly about 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, the Gakkai's numbers had grown and grown. But not only had the numbers grown, but through sincere faith, the good fortune of the members was growing. And because of their intense gratitude for that, they were willing to give in Japan more and more in terms of financial donation to the local temple. That was their local temple, of course. They supported it. They financed it. And temples that were built for perhaps 400 believers in a particular neighborhood suddenly discovered they had 15 or 20,000 believers, all of whom wished to make donation and support the temple, following absolutely the guidance of Mr. Makiguchi and Mr. Toda and later Sensei, all of whom viewed the protection of the priesthood as a specific role for the lay people and taught that to every member. So this was another factor which had great bearing on the priesthood, because not only were they remarkably ignorant in terms of faith, but also they were then tempted to live a rather lazy and luxurious life, which became far more important than keeping the precepts, say. And of course, added to that, virtually all priests were married and had children, mostly. So they were materially tempted just the same way, of course, by the requirements of their family, their wives, their children, and so on, their education, all the usual things that we who are married and have families have to go through ourselves. So this was an insidious sort of process of degeneration, really, this combination of various factors. So it wasn't, of course, by chance that beginning in October last year, Sensei gave a lecture on the 26 Admonitions. This was the first time, I think I'm right in saying, he'd done so since the year of his inauguration. Because interestingly enough, when Sensei was inaugurated president in 1960, 3 months after his inauguration, he gave a lecture on the 26 Admonitions to the leaders of that time, and emphasizing, I think, again, the importance that the Soka Gakkai put on observing these 26 warnings absolutely strictly. So recently, as I say, last October, Sensei lectured on it, and then when we went to Japan for the annual November visit for the SGI General Meeting, Sensei had arranged for President Akiya to give a lecture to all of us who came from overseas on the same subject. And it became apparent that really the time was right for us all to master these. So far as the priesthood was concerned, in November, Sensei said that in terms of faith, the victory had been won. That is to say, in upholding the purity of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism and not letting it be spoilt and polluted by any other beliefs. What he actually said at that time was, the issue with the priesthood of the Nikken sect is over, he said. We have won the victory. We all know how evil the actions of Nikken have been. Therefore, he said, there is absolutely no point in going on and on talking about them unless you have an established Danto group in your country whose actions need to be refuted. Now, he said, we should rather consolidate our strength and get underway our advance to the achievement of actual Kosen-Rufu. In fact, what it was translated at was full-blown Kosen-Rufu. I'd not heard him use that term before, and always I'd heard him talk about laying the foundations of Kosen-Rufu in Japan and in our various countries. But this time he actually said we now should get underway our advance to the achievement of full-blown Kosen-Rufu. That is to say, the foundations are now laid, and now we move into a new, whole new phase of the actual establishment of Kosen-Rufu itself. Of course, he didn't say how long it'll take, but we've moved specifically into a new phase. That's very clear. So, bearing in mind that Sensei always teaches that when we are faced with a great challenge, we should go to the point of victory first in our daimoku, when we're in front of the gonzo. That is the only way to win against all odds. So I'm quite sure that he made this statement, we have won our victory, because in faith he knew in his daimoku we'd won, though the actuality of winning, the nitty-gritty, if you like, of winning, has not yet been achieved. So I hope that's clear. It's a lesson in itself, this matter of challenging matters in our own individual lives. It's not a question of pleading, is it, or begging. You're not on your knees before some all-powerful God. You are determining with or we should be determining with all of our ichinen. And that is very difficult when you have doubts. So Sensei illustrated that best of all in The Human Revolution, Volume 10, when he was instructed by Mr. Toda to go up to the Kansai, to Osaka, and Shakabuku, I think it was 118,000 people in 8 months, if I remember rightly. Well, you can imagine what you'd feel like. Most of you, if I said that to any of you, you'd all say, well, this time, poor old Dick, you know, he's really gone off the rails. And actually, in The Human Revolution, Sensei describes this struggle that he had. I think thoughts like that may have gone through his mind, you see. And he describes how he sweated in front of the gonzen chanting Daimoku because he couldn't see how such a thing was in the least possible. But at the same time, he describes how these thoughts always came back to him, but if it's not possible, Mr. Toda would never have asked me to do this. So he had this struggle going on in his life. And he describes how literally he was in despair week after week after week in front of the gonzen because he couldn't believe it was possible, even with the power of the gonzen. And then he said when he was at his worst, often some Gosho passage would drift across his mind like a cloud, he said, and encourage him. And he'd sort of freshen his approach and start again. But this is really important for all of us, this teaching. This is the way, when you really face something great, I'm sure many of you have already, but when that comes, that's the way you've got to challenge it. No other way will work, because you have to absolutely know with your whole life, your whole ichinen, in other words, is free, flowing towards that certain victory, certain because you come to realize at last that it's only your miserable mind that is doubting the power of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and that Nam-myoho Renge Kyo actually is the power of the entire universe that one is bringing to bear on that particular problem. So you go to the point of victory first as you chant Daimoku. You're there. You've won. There you are. There was Sensei, of course, with 118,000 bodhisattvas of the earth on the plains of Osaka, clear in his mind. At some point, everything turned 180 degrees. And he knew, of course, that he could do it. That if Mr. Toda said that, it could be done through the limitless power of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. And he did it. He did it. And one day, alone, they shakabuku'd 11,111 people. Can you believe it? So the whole foundations of the movement for Kosen-rufu in the Kansai were laid at that time. And as you know, it's the strongest. It's famous for its power and strength and unity. The movement for Kosen-rufu in the Kansai is a model for everyone in Japan. And the other members elsewhere acknowledge it. They're proud of the Kansai members. So that's where it all grew from. It was incredible. But you see, there's always this awful thing, our minds, which is narrowing our view, so that our ichinen is just a pathetic little sort of dribble. Oh yes, I'll do that, but that's the problem, and it's the battle with our own minds. Anyway, while we're on this subject, it's no bad thing to have this reminder about going to the point of victory first. We win the battle in front of the Gons. It's the battle of Ichinen. Once you've got Ichinen, combined with Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, you can achieve the impossible, or what may seem almost like the impossible. Right. So, where have I got to? I've lost my place on here. Right. I think at this point it's good to just clear up one matter, which is that some people I know think, well, if these priests were deteriorating in terms of their actions of faith over so many years, why on earth didn't the leaders of the Gakkai try and stop it or challenge it much earlier on? And of course the answer to that is that they did. Ever since Mr. Makaguchi's time, ever since, that is to say, the Gakkai began to grow in the 1930s, they have had to challenge time and again, always hoping that somehow or other the priests would recognize the way to handle matters in this day and age and overcome the sort of medieval view of things which they had had since going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So as you know, the first time it came to a head was at the beginning of World War II, when the government issued an edict that people would have a Shinto shrine in their homes and would worship the emperor as a god, as he used to be worshipped in times gone by, and in this way to strengthen their hold and discipline over all the people of Japan in order to win their aggressive campaigns in the Far East. And included in that was an edict to all religions in Japan that they were to incorporate certain doctrine of Shinto, including emperor worship, in the teachings. And the head temple did it. They gave in. They established a Shinto shrine in the head temple, and they gave in to the requests of the ruling authorities. And Mr. Toda, as we know from the Human Revolution, Mr. Toda and Mr. Makiguchi went to the head temple. Mr. Makiguchi faced the priests and remonstrated with his whole life against this slander. Of course it was courageous. Both he and Mr. Toda must have known the whole Japanese authorities would be on them and would persecute them. The priests used every excuse that this was the only way they could protect the teachings. But in protecting the teachings, they were destroying them. Because including that, the government required, or the priests decided to cut out various sentences and paragraphs in the Gosho because they knew that they would stir up the enmity of the ruling authorities. And it's possible now to see the document where these various passages from many different Gosho were cut out if it was thought they would upset the government. So of course it's very, very pathetic. And Toda and Mr. Makiguchi stood firm. The head temple wouldn't agree, but they refused to put their Shinto shrines in their homes, and as you know, they were imprisoned and brainwashed. Mr. Makiguchi died in prison. And the go-between over all this, the go-between, the head temple and the government, was a priest, and he was an incredible slanderer. Anyway, when the war ended, he was the one who, the young people, believing that he had betrayed Mr. Makiguchi and Mr. Toda, really demanded should make his apology and give up being a priest. And this got Mr. Toda into all sorts of trouble after World War II. And at one point he was sacked, just like Sensei's been sacked. But fortunately, they changed their minds after 3 months and brought him back at that time. I think at that time the Gakkai was so important to them. The temple, the head temple, was in ruins, and he called they relied entirely on the Gakkai to have some money in order to repair and bring back the buildings to normal. So it was overcome in that way. But then again later there was more trouble, as you know, about 12 years ago, with what is called the Shoshinkai movement, when Nitatsu Shonin, the 66th high priest, the one before Nikken, died rather suddenly of an illness, and there was no document or statement who should be the next high priest. But amongst the hierarchy of the head temple, it was decided that in the end to make Nikken the high priest. None of us had the slightest idea what went on in all those negotiations. But Nikken is a member of one of the powerful families in the head temple. There are 3 powerful families that vie with each other and have done for a number of years for power in terms of holding authority there. And some way Nikken won. Anyway, over 200 priests disagreed and created all sorts of trouble. They said Nikken was not really the person who Nitatsu would have made high priest. And there was a terrific row went on. And I won't go into all the details now except to say that Nikken won the day because he had been made the high priest, and 24 of the priests who had revolted were sacked, defrocked, whatever the word is used, and the remainder all had a very severe, the top most severe form of reprimand. And that was where things were left. Still, 1 or 2 of those priests, called Shoshinkai, which means correct faith group, are holding out in temples in Japan, believe it or not. They don't agree with anything, by the way. They didn't agree with the Soka Gakkai either, or President Ikeda, or Nikken, or anything except themselves. I think that was the whole point. They wanted the power. Anyway, Shoshinkai, that was another upheaval. But I hope that it's becoming clear, therefore, that always these troubles were occurring, but at the same time, through negotiation, through doing their best to protect the head temple, which was Mr. Makiguchi's most important point or role for the lay people, to protect the priesthood and the head temple. Sensei's attitude, for instance, 10 or 12 years ago, was, we must, Nikken Shonin has been nominated high priest of Nichiren Shoshu by the priesthood. It's their business. We have no say in the matter. Therefore, our task is to continue to follow the guidance of Mr. Makiguchi and protect the high priest and the head temple as we've always done. So always hoping that things would get better. But sadly, they've not got better. And perhaps in the end, when we look back, we'll really understand that this all had to happen. That through this happening, a much-needed reform of the priesthood will take place, which will be appropriate for modern times and for the new century. And matters of such importance as the fact that Nichiren Daishonin always stated that priest and layperson were equal in every way, this has been highlighted, and these principles have been made very clear. And added to that, as I said earlier, we've all had our problems, our struggles within ourselves to get ourselves right on this whole matter too. Right. We've got 10 minutes to go before the break, so I think we'll try and stick to that. And first I'm going to ask Bill for you to read the preface there and the last words